Hello and welcome to Aararat Consulting's training program on bullying and harassment in the workforce. We're going to divide this training into a number of different modules. You're going to have some really good exercises to do, and we're going to have some video role plays for you. What happens with bullying in the workforce? All too often, it's a matter of subjective interpretation. So, what one person might think is just kidding around, another person might find extremely offensive. Words that one person might use could be just their normal everyday vernacular. And for other people, they could feel that it's intimidating because you're using words on purpose that I don't understand. There are so many different ways for people to interpret intimidation or harassment or isolation or collectively bullying in the workplace. Our job is to help you diagnose, like a doctor, diagnose those things that are truly offensive and those things that are cultural and sometimes those things that are just not much of anything at all. But what we do want is we want to have a safe work environment. My name is Dr. Kevin Aurieux. You can call me Doc O, Dr. KO, Doc O for short. And what we're going to be doing is we're literally going to be teaching you how to diagnose social dis-ease in the marketplace. Now, from part of your preparatory work for this, we were hoping that you would have looked at two different videos from Aararat. One is the parallels between management and medicine, and that's how we teach you how to specifically analyze what we call a situational ethic. And a situational ethic is when a group of people are together and something happens within that dynamic within the group that people don't necessarily feel safe, or people feel offended, or people feel scared, or yes, people feel like they're being bullied or harassed. The thing about Aararat's conflict resolution training is that we are going to teach you specifically how to interact with each other, but not from an antagonistic point of view. No, we want the opposite of antagonism. What we want is something called synergy or synergism. And that's the second thing you were supposed to have done in preparation for this training program. I have a TED Talk, and it was hoped that you had watched that TED Talk specifically as it relates to making connection between those that are in authority. We're going to say figuratively they're somewhere up here, and people that are what's called subordinate. Doesn't mean they're inferior, because if you watch the TED Talk, you would have heard me say, I don't believe that anybody is superior to anybody else. But what is a fact is that some people in management have more responsibility. And in Aararat, we always say that being a boss is not a privilege, it's a responsibility. So, further to that responsibility, in virtually any jurisdiction in the United States or Canada, it is now mandated. It's a regulation now that we take training on bullying and intimidation and harassment. And the reason for that is, if you can think back about 5 years, there was a number of different suicides where the person that ended their life made a video prior to doing that. It was like their suicide note, and they published it on YouTube. And maybe for the only time, first time or the only time, they were able to express how they were feeling because of certain interactions. And it made people sit up and listen. So now in schools, there's definitely bullying harassment policies. And in the workplaces, doesn't matter where you are, the United States or Canada, there are regulations. I'm from Vancouver, Canada, Vancouver, British Columbia, or BC, and we have something called WorkSafe BC. And WorkSafe BC has a very good platform, if you will, for how to address bullying, intimidation, and harassment in the workforce. And the acronym for that is PPT. And we're going to get right in with PPT. PPT. You try to say that 5 times quickly. We're going to get right into the PPT now. Okay, so in any workplace situation, the very first thing that's required in order to create a safe environment, and that's what we want an environment where everybody feels safe, they feel comfortable, because that's going to help us be the best we can be in terms of our contribution and our productivity. Me personally, I love it when at the end of a day I go, wow, that really felt productive. It just gives me a much better evening. I get a better night's sleep, as opposed to those days that are really disjointed and there's a whole bunch of pressure and there's chaos and there's confusion. Those don't feel like good days. So, as far as it relates to reducing chaos or pressure from interpersonal dynamics, well, that's what this training is all about. And the very first P in PPT is that you need to have a policy. You have to have a policy on what constitutes a safe work environment. So, most people, when they see some sort of mission statement or guiding principles, it's fairly generic. It says, we believe in respecting each other, and yeah, okay, yada, yada, yada. That's not very specific. You're going to want to create a protocol that is extremely specific, that spells out in really simple English something that anybody could understand. And at the end of this policy, anybody would come to the conclusion this company takes work safe or worker safety seriously. Not in the physical, like in industrial or construction or mining, not that type of safety. We're talking about not physical, but mental, emotional, and even spiritual, where spiritual is whether we have faith and trust in each other. So, again, this was in the TED Talk. And if you haven't watched the TED Talk, you were supposed to. So, we hope you get to at the end of today, because when we go into training again tomorrow, we're going to keep referring back to the data that was garnished over a 5-year sociological research project that relates to the workplace. Anyway, as far as a policy is concerned, the policy has to have some sort of substance that would lead someone to believe that, yes, this is going to be a place where I can expect to have safety. And in the event that something occurs that mentally, emotionally, or spiritually, I feel a sense of dis-ease, then I know that in order to maintain the integrity of that policy, that there's going to be certain procedures in place that I or anybody else can take to come to a resolution. And that's what the second P stands for in PPT. Having first had a policy, which, let's face it, could just be words if they're not followed, then you put teeth to it. And the teeth you put to it is these are the procedures that this company will follow in the event that something is happening with interpersonal dynamics within our workforce whereby someone doesn't feel safe. Those procedures, once again, need to be fairly simple in the language, but very specific in the application. We're going to show you how to do that because we're going to introduce 10 guiding principles that Aararat Consulting teaches other corporations. These 10 guiding principles are specifically so that in the event that something goes south, something isn't feeling comfortable, you have a sense of social dis-ease, that can be resolved and everybody can get back to a place of comfort and safety. And then the third thing in PPT is the T, and the T stands for training, and that's exactly what we're doing now. So your company obviously understands that it's mandated that such education is available. We are hoping that not only will this be good content, we're hoping this will be enlightening, and we're hoping that it'll actually be, when possible, a little bit entertaining. So let's start with the first thing that occurs when there's conflict in the workplace. And the first thing that occurs when there's conflict in the workplace is that somebody has done something that's considered moralistically wrong. So, what we say is, what is the moral climate of your company? And the moral climate should be something to the effect that nobody feels that they are being singled out because of something that they say or something that they do that isn't harmful. What do we mean by isn't harmful? Well, we're going to say if everybody acts in a behavior that's relatively normal, then normally people follow a pretty easy to understand set of moral ethos or ethics. And the moral ethics that we follow, for the better part in any given society, dictate that I should not be in danger just as I go about my everyday activities. So let's place this in the workplace. If I come to work, then I should be able to come to work not expecting that something's going to happen whereby I feel endangered, not just physically, but mentally or emotionally or spiritually. So the standards that we put in place is that we have to first define what is abnormal. So let's do this differentiation, and it's in your notes. What is normal? And we define normal at Aararat Consulting is any behavior or any speech pattern that is not harmful to somebody else. So here's rocket science. If that's normal, then what's abnormal? Well, abnormal is any behavior or any speech patterns that put somebody in a perceived sense of risk or a perceived sense of danger. And here's what's important: perceived. And perception is reality. So, because I'm from Vancouver, then I like hockey, so I'm a Vancouver Canucks fan. Big surprise. If somebody comes into our company and they're from Seattle, so they've just, gone up I-5 for a few miles and they're working in Vancouver now, then they're going to, if they're a hockey fan, they're going to be following the Kraken. Now, if they're an avid Kraken fan and I'm an avid Canucks fan, we should not be getting to blows over this, okay? So here's an example of what's normal or abnormal. Just because I go for the Canucks and they go for the Kraken, neither of those are harmful. So we have a phrase and a concept that we use, and it goes like this: normal is what I like to do. Normal is what I like to do. So if I have a certain speech pattern or I have certain quirks, in my behavior that aren't harmful, then that's all they are. Is there Kevin's personality coming out? It might be a little bit quirky in some way, shape, or form, but it's not harmful to anybody. And I'm going to continue to act the way that I normally act because this is who I am, and that's my normal. So if we are prepared to see people's day-to-day behavior and their day-to-day speech patterns in such a way that that's who they are and it isn't harmful, then we have to come to the conclusion, well, that's just normal for them, even though nobody in their right mind would normally want to watch the Kraken play hockey when they can watch the Canucks. So now that we understand what normal is and now that we understand what abnormal is, now we're going to get to a point of using certain procedures to resolve conflict in the event that somebody has perceived some sort of grievance. And when they perceive the grievance, what typically happens is they come to somebody higher up the ladder in management and they say, I have a grievance. And now it's the manager's job to take the parties that are antagonistically at odds with each other and see what needs to be done to resolve it. So when a manager goes into that role, then we call that adjudication. Now, you might think umpire or referee. Those are a little too harsh. They're adjudicating. And what they're going to do is they're going to listen to both parties. They're going to try to understand the entire situation. Remember earlier we called that a situational ethic. And then they're going to try to help both parties see eye to eye. And all too often, what happens is there's just a miscommunication between two parties because they're communicating the way they normally do. But when this person speaks in their normal vernacular and this person uses their normal vernacular or colloquialisms, then miscommunication leads to misunderstanding, and misunderstanding leads to conflict. So that's in your notes. It's something you might want to memorize. Miscommunication leads to misunderstanding, and misunderstanding leads to conflict. So, what sort of ways can we resolve conflict in the event that some other party in our work environment, okay, so our work environment, which is full of people, and when it's full of people, it's dynamic. We call that your environmental dynamic. What happens when within your environmental dynamic, some sort of conflict arises? How are you going to get past me insisting that my normal is the only normal? So back to this illustration, you have to be a Vancouver Canucks fan if you're working in Vancouver, as opposed to me allowing another person to have what I might think is a kind of quirky, maybe even a little bit crazy perspective that the Kraken are a better hockey player, of a better hockey team. The management is going to have you understand that in the event that I am so stubborn, so set in my ways, you might even call it pig-headed, to believe that somebody can't watch hockey unless they're a Canucks fan, management has to help somebody like me, if that's my mindset, understand that I'm being intolerant. Because remember, the other person who likes the Seattle Kraken, they are not doing anything harmful. The manager has to help me in this situation understand that if I don't allow people to express their normality, then by definition, I'm intolerant. It does dry out your throat. Well, and this is what intolerance look. Sorry, Darcy, you're going to cut that out. And this is what intolerance looks like personified. And we're going to show a picture of Hitler. Because in this man's mindset, everybody had to be Aryan. In this man's mindset, unlike what I proclaimed in my TED Talk, I don't believe anyone's superior to anybody. This man felt that a specific demographic, a specific type of person was a master race. And anybody that didn't belong to that master race was therefore expendable. So in the event that we have a conflict, if the goal is we don't want to have a mindset like Hitler, we don't want to have a mindset of I'm superior, and we don't want to have a mindset of intolerance, well, then we're going to look at the opposite of intolerance. And one way to look at the opposite of intolerance is to consider what it means to be gracious or forgiving. And that's our first guiding principle. Because our first guiding principle deals with the whole reality that in a workplace environmental dynamic, especially if the workplace is fairly large, if the workforce itself is fairly large, and especially if you're in the Pacific Northwest, we have so much diversity in our citizenry. There's so much different ethnic, diversity. There's so much, diversity in terms of the different demographics in the workforce. For the first time in history, we have 5 generations in the workforce. And we also have diversity in terms of language, if for no other reason that young adults have a completely different language or vernacular than people that are 10 years, 20 years, in some cases, 40 years older. And we have to be accepting or gracious or even forgiving if somebody uses some type of communication that we don't think is normal and we actually perceive it to be offensive. So remember, normal is something that isn't harmful to somebody else. And if we're going to be tolerant, then we have to be prepared to be forgiving. This is our first guiding principle, because our first guiding principle deals with this whole diversity of the human species. And it goes like this: everybody's human and makes mistakes. To treat each other humanely is to forgive those mistakes. Now, you'll recall that we said when you have procedures is what you do to apply solutions to achieve your policy. And your policy is whatever your company mission statement might be. You have to have a policy in place that suggests to any new employee and every employee that your company is a company that is safe to work at. So when you apply these procedures, and we just gave you the first one, we said the language has to be fairly simple, but that doesn't mean that its application is that simple. So let's review that first procedure again as it relates to conflict resolution. We have the mindset everybody's human and makes mistakes. To treat each other humanely is to forgive the mistakes. Okay, let's look at mistakes. Because whenever we do a 5-day training program, when we have everybody settled at the very beginning of the first morning, we just say, by a show of hands, anybody who's perfect, could you please raise your hand? And of course, nobody does, because nobody thinks they're perfect, except for maybe somebody with some sort of psychiatric disorder. So none of us are perfect. And by definition, what prevents us from being perfect is that we've made a mistake. And to bring this one home, to make it a little clearer, there was a time that I was doing a training program back east, and I asked everybody in the audience, is anybody here perfect? And the guy actually raised his hand. And I looked at him and I waited, and he kept his hand up. So I asked him what his name was, and he said his name was Billy Bob or whatever. And I said, Billy Bob, do you honestly think you're perfect? And he says, well, I used to be perfect, but then I made a mistake. And later on, I found out I was mistaken. So Billy Bob was the class clown. And once it sunk in, everybody gave him a chuckle, and I identified him as, okay, he's the stand-up comedian in the group here. But honestly, Billy Bob, do you think you're perfect? And he sheepishly said, no, I'm not perfect, and I don't think anybody is. And I said, well, good, Billy Bob, because either do I, and apparently either does anybody else here. So if we're human and we're not perfect, then by definition, we're going to make mistakes. So now the question is, how do we handle a mistake? A lot of times the mistake is based on miscommunication. And when we do these 5-day training programs for a company, we won't do the training program unless the higher tiers, the C-suite, the management takes a small training program first. And that training program is in communication. Everybody thinks they're great communicators, the same way that everybody knows they're not perfect. Fact of the matter is, everybody is not a great communicator. And remember, we don't want antagonism. We want synergy. And the first breakdown to synergy is lack of proper direction or communication from management. And you heard me right. If there's a conflict in the workplace, if something goes wrong, if a mistake is made, very, very often it's because of lack of good communication from management. It's not the employee's fault. It's not the people in the rank and file that made the mistake. It was communication. And miscommunication leads to misunderstanding. And then misunderstanding leads to conflict. So, as it relates to everybody's human and makes mistakes, if we can identify that all that happened was there was a communication breakdown, then we should be able to be gracious and forgiving and certainly tolerant and say, oh, okay, I misunderstood what you meant. We're actually okay. Let's move forward. Miscommunication leads to misunderstanding. And the person says, actually, misunderstood what you meant. Now, remember, if you're living in a city or a region that's very diverse as far as ethnicity is concerned, imagine if you come to Seattle or you come to Vancouver and English is not your first language. And you hear something like the word bear. Well, does that mean like to bear somebody's burden? Does that mean bare naked, like the bare naked ladies? Does that mean rawr, like this carnivore? See, when English is not your first language, there's a lot of nuances that we have. And somebody can just completely misunderstand it. So I'll give you a really good example. I know this extremely skilled technician, and he's from Korea, and he loves karaoke. So he invited me to his house, and he had this amazing karaoke setup. Like it would actually give you a score out of 100 as to how well you kept tempo, how well your voice hit the appropriate pitches, how long you sustained notes. It was really, really amazing. But he had this one song, it was an older song that some of you might recognize, and he showed it to me, and he was really confused. And the song goes like this. It's from a movie. You say potato, I say potato. You say tomato, I say tomato. And at the end of it, they're saying because of these differences, which are not harmful, because of these differences in pronunciation, which is their normal, they come to the conclusion that, they're going to get married and they're going to call the whole thing off. And that's where things get ridiculous because we need to be tolerant of certain nuances and certain differences that people have specifically in communication. So for this Korean man, he was showing me the words to the song, and it sounded like this. Excuse those of you that are Korean, I'm going to try to imitate his English accent. He says, you say tomato, I say tomato. You say potato, I say potato. I do not understand the song. Get it? So when miscommunication leads to misunderstanding, or when misunderstanding leads to conflict, all we have to do is identify the root of the miscommunication. And this is one of our concepts. We have 32 concepts that identify what caused a problem. And one of them is, that is what I said, that's not what I meant. So I'm going to give you a personal example. So in one of my businesses, I was dealing with a young lady in her mid-20s, brilliant young woman, like so intelligent, so sharp. And in the midst of me teaching her something that she had asked me to teach her, and this was outside of work, this is a personal problem she had, and she wanted to hear like my psychological perspective of conflict between her and her best friend over an event that was planned that went south. So I said, okay, if we're going to do that, then you're going to have to write me ideally pages of detail because I want to hear your perspective. And then I'm going to ask you what you thought her perspective was. So anyway, she was very, very good for this assignment. So when we did get together one day after work, she had like 4 pages, lined paper, single spaced. And she was really emotionally connected to how the whole situation turned sour. And in the process of me describing different psychological principles that lead us to conflict, I use the word Google. And to me, Google means resource. To me, it's like encyclopedia. Google is you can look something up. But as I was talking to her and I used the word Google, she stopped paying attention to me and she went down to her phone and she was doing this and she continued to do it. So I stopped talking and she continued to do this. And assumptively, I thought maybe she was texting a friend, but she wasn't listening to me. And she was the one that asked for my guidance on my time. So after probably about 15, 20 seconds of silence, I said to her, do you think that what you're doing right now is socially inappropriate? Now, I didn't accuse her. I said, do you think that what you're doing right now is socially inappropriate? And she had the most shocked look in her face. And she said, why would it be socially inappropriate? I said, because you're playing on your phone when you're supposed to be listening to me. And she said, I'm only doing what you told me to do. I said, when did I tell you to text your friends? She goes, I'm not texting my friends. So I asked her, well, what are you doing? She says, I'm doing exactly what you said. I'm Googling. See, she took the word Google, which for me was a noun, and she turned it into a verb. She thought I wanted her to look something up. So when she stopped looking at me and her thumbs went onto her phone, she was Googling. So you see how the communication there? I'm using Google as a noun. She's using it as a verb. She's actually doing in her mind exactly what I asked her to do. I'm taking offense at it because I think she might be acting in a socially inappropriate way, or let's just say rude. So as we worked the problem backwards and came to the conclusion that my word Google and her word Google had different applications, it became kind of funny, but it was the concept. Well, that is what I said, but that's not what I meant. And as soon as we can figure out that it's just a breakdown in communication, then you know what? If we're gracious, if we're tolerant, if we're forgiving, we'll just move on and we learn something. Let me give you another example. One of the men that I work with, he went and he did an exchange in Japan. And in Japan, when you're having something like miso soup, it's considered good manners to slurp the soup, make a whole bunch of noise. Well, when I was growing up, my mother would have boxed my ears, if I did that, if I was spooning soup and I was slurping it. But in Japan, that's considered a form of compliment to the host or to the hostess. Whereas when I grew up, at least, it was considered rude. So sometimes not our speech like Google, sometimes not our speech like potato, potato, tomato, tomato, capillary, protein, proteins, all that sort of stuff. It can lead to some confusion, but there's nothing abnormal, there's nothing harmful about it. We just have to work things backwards a little bit and take into consideration that somebody has an accent. And if they have an accent, that's normal for them. It's just not normal for my ears. And it's not normal for my normal group of friends who say capillary and protein and potato and tomato. When we've got a conflict based on miscommunication, we need to work it backwards. And as soon as we can find the root, so this is actually in your notes, you can use this when you're playing Scrabble and you've got nothing but vowels. We want to see the root of the problem, or what's called the etiology of the problem. How's that for a word with a whole bunch of vowels? So the etiology is what caused it in the first place. But if we're not prepared to take the time and give careful consideration to what the other person says or thinks or feels, if we just want to insist that we're right, then what we're doing is we're being stubborn. Because if I insist that I'm right, and I'm absolutely right, and I'm 100% right, and the other person is wrong, so wrong, oh so wrong, 100% wrong. Well, in any given conflict, there are two sides to every story. And with me and this young woman from my company, there's her side, his side, and the truth. And her side was right, and my side was right, and the truth was we were both misunderstanding each other because of a nuance. Now, Once we determine the etiology, or once we determine the root cause of the problem, this is where we want to be forgiving. It's like, oh, wow, I am so sorry. I didn't know that, or I didn't hear you say that, or I never would have considered bear to be caring as opposed to bear. I thought you were trying to be aggressive like these growly animals, along the coast with their big claws and their big teeth. Once we determine that we are mistaken, and remember, everyone's human and makes mistakes, and none of us are perfect. Once we determine we're mistaken, this is when we want to literally say, I am so terribly sorry. I never considered it from that point of view. You are completely right. And I can guarantee you that 97% of the population, and that's not a random number, 97% of the population, if you extend that grace genuinely, sincerely, apologetically, watch them do the exact same thing back to you and say, well, I never considered it from your point of view either. That's what it is to be tolerant. That's what it is to be gracious. And that's what it is to be forgiving. The only way that you won't be tolerant, you won't be gracious, and you won't be forgiving is that if you think that you never make any mistakes ever. And then your name is either God or you're a complete narcissist. And we'll stop there because it's getting close to time for you to go home. I want to watch